Hello. Over the past couple of weeks, I've had the immense honor of being able to have two wide-ranging discussions with Bill Harkleroad, also known under the stage name Zoot Horn Rollo, and we touch upon quite a few different topics in our discussions, ranging from what he's doing now, his general philosophy of music, to, of course, his years in the Magic Band performing the music of Captain Beefheart. So before we launch into the interview, I just wanted to make a couple of brief statements. The first is that Bill has been devoting a lot of his time and energy to teaching. So if that's something that you're interested in hearing more about, you can visit his website, which is zoothornrollo.com. And the second is that during the first portion of the interview, you'll notice that the audio quality is not up to my usual standard. That was due to a bug in my recording software, but please note that it does improve as the interview continues on. So I really hope you enjoy the discussion, and let's get into it. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about was basically what you're doing at the moment, because I've read your book, Lunar Notes, which I believe came out in the late 90s, in 97. And I've also listened quite a lot to your solo record, which came out in 2001. And I think that for a lot of people, those documents are a major source of information about your life and about your art and about what you are doing. So maybe you could fill us in a little bit about what you've been doing since then.
Okay. I did basically half of an LP worth of music, about a half hour worth of music, wanting to pay for it, so I wasn't doing out of pocket because I'm not dealing with record companies or anybody paying for it. So I thought that was a way to get the music out there, and they were all based on masks. They were the titles and the inspiration for the tunes, and so those are out there also, like the Bozo is. And then to my surprise, music is all free, and that was an amazing thing. At first, I think I tried to downplay it because it hurt me a lot, because I thought this was going to be some way for me to be able to continue writing and having it pay for itself at least. I don't want to do vanity projects.
Yeah.
And so I only did half. The second half is kind of kicking around, and then I just went, okay, I'm done. I'm just teaching. So that became the source of income. You got to pay the bills. But musically, I think your question is probably more about that. After the Beefheart thing, I really wanted to study. And after Mallard, right after that, I kind of moved into the hills of Oregon and practiced and played only classic guitar for 6-7 years. So I started reading again and started reading theory books and started practicing, and then gradually went back into electric guitar and did that. So that kind of got me forward to, long story long, what I'm doing now. And basically, I'm an improviser. And somewhere along the line, when I heard Keith Jarrett sit down and play as if it was a composition, totally improvised, I said, I want to be able to do that. And so that's been a long struggle. Of course, I'm not Keith Jarrett, amazing player. But so I'm currently working on newer vocabulary as an improviser. So whatever pitch combinations is chordal units, but not chords, not standard 1, 3, 5, 7 stuff, but trying to build a vocabulary, and then I just have a list of things that I want to be able to play in either major, harmonic minor, melodic minor, and now harmonic major. So if I have a particular voicing, I want to be able to play them through, as in fourths or fifths or whatever, through any of those key sources, so that it's jazz theory. I have a chord sitting there. I want to be able to approach that chord or talk to the chords, is how I think of it, with a vocabulary that is meaningful to me. So it comes from jazz theory, but I'm not a jazz player.
Okay, interesting. Well, maybe we could connect that to the solo record. We saw Bozo Under the Sea, and you could tell us a little bit about how that was put together. Was there a great deal of improvisation in that? Because I understand that you wrote those in MIDI, right? And then...
Yes.
Yeah.
All MIDI. And kudos to Greg Bindi, the drummer, because he created a freedom so it didn't sound so stodgy, and broken up. But that was the only way I could afford to do it. And then it still cost. I made money on it. Hooray, But so I MIDI'd up all the parts, wrote all the bass parts, and there was slight improvisation there. The horn players and the solos that they played were totally improvised to try to breathe some life into a stiff way to do it. But again, I wanted to do some music, and I wanted good players, but I couldn't afford to fly people around to play at the same time and do all that. So that was the way I did it. Once Greg had put his drum parts on, then it became very live feeling, and we reacted to that. So he really set the table in a lot of ways. I give him a lot of credit. Very great musician. And then he put vibes on. Still, those tunes were, I hope I'm much better than I was back then. That's basically 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I have always been a blues player at heart. Those are really blues things. That has to be the element in there for me. There's something earthy about that really appeals to me. Although some of the classic guitar stuff shows up here and there, nice patina or something like that. It has an element of that, So, but, it's hard for me to listen to now. It's quite a long time ago. But it was blues-based and just basically just trying to satisfy my ears. I'm just trying to do something that I would want to hear again.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of improvised things, I'll say this. A friend of mine, Nels Klein, very good guitar player, and he just says, produce, and he does, But sometimes if I was in that, I'm not going to say for him, but for me, if I was in that, I'd play it once, and it was a great experience, and I'd never want to hear it again. I don't think that's composition, and I want to be better than that. I want to be able to play something that I can even listen to myself a few times afterwards.
Right.
And that's, if that makes sense, But definitely that album was, blues-based with the things that I've kind of studied and learned. There's always, going to be these other elements in there, but
right.
That's pretty much what that is.
So that was a highly pre-composed piece of music,
Yes.
right? So there's very little, even in the solos, I imagine there's very little improvising.
No, I was improvising.
Oh, you were improvising?
Yeah, all my solos I just played.
Okay.
And I tried not to do a lot of editing and things like that, so I left all the messed up stuff in there and the fuzzy stuff. I left it in there. At least I wanted that, if in an intellectual way, to make it more real and not so stiff.
Yeah.
So those were improvised, and the horn parts and whatever parts were improvised. But all, and the bass parts slipped out of it here and there to create some natural feel. But the bass parts, the chordal stuff, all the baritone parts that were backing all that, all composed for sure.
Okay. One of the things that really strikes me about that disc is the extraordinary variety of guitar tones. And actually that's something that I would say with regards to your recorded body of work, period. But it's particularly in evidence on that record, where there's an extraordinary array of different sounds and timbres and approaches to guitar playing. So is that something that you consciously set out to do, or does it sort of flow naturally out of your practice as a musician?
The second part. I think it's more of an organic process for me. I'm not parallel, I've been serial, okay? Grew up as a kid, learned jazz standards at 15, and I played surf music. And all these different times, I was one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But after you get really old, that serial of events turns into those things, so you pull back on some of those. Like I said, the classical period was really important to me, to visit that, to play that music, and have to be as articulate as possible, because I really revere the technique of classical players. But so those things are there, but then I have to do my thing to them just to make it make sense to me sonically. And I have to please my ears. So because I've been doing it in various versions of it, where I'm a guitar doing simple. Okay, that stuff, right? So if I'm playing like that, or different shapes like that, I want the sound of the instrument to match what I'm trying to play.
Okay, so I found it very interesting what you said about the project where you recorded half an LP. So I gather that the radical restructuring of the music industry that's occurred over the past 10 to 20 years has been an issue for you, as it has been for a lot of musicians. And I find it genuinely unfortunate that a lot of people are discouraged from recording for that reason, because it's become so extraordinarily difficult to get paid for what you're doing. So, do you see a remedy to this situation? You as a performer, as a very established guitarist, even you have to deal with this problem.
I don't know. I am so stuck in my ways now, and I guess I'm trying to fit into being this old man now and just get through life. In the current world, events and things, we'll just leave politics out of it. But it's tough enough. So I'm just trying to find a way to deal with all that. But I don't know how it progresses. I don't know what a 22-year-old thinks. Personally, I don't think I had enough life experience to be making decisions that everything should be free when I was that young and inexperienced. And I think that art is really greatly suffering because of that. Because I am not a performer. I never really liked it. There was moments, of course, and that exhilarating thing of playing with people and standing in the sound. I miss that greatly. But not the falderah of going out there and flying places and dealing with performer. I'm not a performer. So the only way that your music is now is a business card to sell tickets at an event. So it's geared to totally about performing. And if you're one of those, it's great. It's fine. But I think it's dumbing down music. We go back to Napster and all that stuff, right? When that first started happening. And again, I think a lot of choices are made by very intelligent 16 to 22-year-olds that have no life experience yet. And so that's a weird thing that seems to be playing out. I don't know how it goes. But since technology facilitates all of this ability to write things, everybody has a home studio, that type of stuff, people can create music. Getting it out there and having access to it is the other part, you know.
Right. So there is an upside to it. It sort of democratizes the process of making a record in a certain sense. It's a lot cheaper and more portable than it ever was before, but you still have the problem of monetizing it and getting it out into the public.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I noticed that you with your YouTube thing, right? Brilliant. You know, I kind of shied away from a lot of that. I just wanted to establish myself as a teacher. I go, this is something I can feel good about. I feel that that's a strength of my abilities. So that's. I just went, okay. I don't want to worry about all that. I have enough things to worry about. You know, so you know, I just. But then again, I'm all over YouTube. You know, just to bring up a name, I saw one of the things you talked about, Kurtog. Is that how you say it?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I just started Googling. I like string quartets a lot because it reminds me. I grew up in a 4-piece band, right? And it reminds me of that. And so I wanted things from the 20th century, early 1900s stuff to start hearing more modern things. And I ran into this guy, and I went, man, some of this is so cool. Now I couldn't tell you what it's doing. I know you were saying that. I'd like to have that conversation after this, but so those things are exciting to me. You know, so the YouTube thing and young musicians. I don't know, there's a guy, Joey Alexander. I don't know if you know who I mean. From Indonesia, Bali, I don't know where, but and he taught himself how to play through YouTube videos. He came here at 9 years old, and everybody's going, oh my gosh, who is this kid? So he has this video, and there's a bunch of them. At 11 years old, and he's playing through giant steps and, not my favorite music, but difficult to play, 3-tonic system and all that. And so he's just playing through there, and he's this 9, 10, 11-year-old kid sitting there going, yeah, I like John Coltrane. And then all of a sudden, when it's time to play, he's 50 years old. He's an amazing, almost like a Mozart type of kid. Okay, he is that special. There's a bunch of those happening now. So that's the good side, is that those people we wouldn't even know existed. So through this YouTube thing and the learning, the teaching thing of the availability of the stuff, that's the flip side of it.
Right.
But making money for a non-performer, it's not going to happen for me. Or I haven't figured out that way yet. Let's say that.
But I find it fantastic that you actually were able to not only recoup your expenses with the solo record, but actually make money. So, I mean, compared to the Beefheart stuff, where presumably there are no residuals coming to any of the performers who played on those.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Gail Zappa owns it. Well, she's gone now, but the Zappa Trust owns those things. I don't know. There must have been, after all this time, some paychecks. Certainly not. Commiserate with how much people want to talk about it.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted to, yeah, because that's a big topic. But I wanted to talk about also your pedagogical activities and what you've been doing as a teacher. So, what sort of age range are you working with at the moment?
At the moment, pretty much, I would say older, your age and older. I think you're 36, 37, something like that.
Yeah, I'm 36.
But I've had from 6, 7 years old to 80s. I try to take on as many different things as possible so that I'm not dealing with the same type person. Skype has been within the last two years of doing that. Okay. But basically, if I have all the same type of student, it's not comfortable. I like complete beginners. I like advanced players. I'll get these people with advanced degrees come here from Berklee School of Music. They do one lesson. I go, really? Guys with PhD and they're talking serial harmony, 12-tone stuff. And I'm going, I know what you're talking about, but why they just want to learn something different than what they know,
right.
Which is cool. So I like that engagement for me because the whole thing is I'm being paid to learn. Okay, so that engagement, it's a little more human connection that way. And over the years of teaching, there's few people where I dealt with a lot of people that would lose their partner grief victims and things like that, so they needed something to get into, is people with strokes, any of those things. So I do all of that. My online stuff, yeah, that's probably at least half people that were fans, but then again, probably in your age group or people that can afford to do it.
As a teacher, I mean, you certainly have an extraordinary background, one that not a lot of teachers will have. And you make yourself available for lessons, which is extraordinary in itself. So I'm wondering what sort of influence that might have on your approach to teaching. I mean, having had all these experiences playing very, let's call it avant-garde music, especially when you were very young, how does that affect the way that you might approach a younger player who's coming to you and wants to develop their skills on an instrument, or does it have any effect at all?
It does a lot, because I try to teach how I wish I had been taught.
Oh, interesting.
Okay? It's like, what would have made sense to me? I mean, trying to be somebody else, okay? You've got an advanced degree in music. I didn't go to music school. I got a lot of books. I went to the library. I decided I needed to learn these things. So there's enough schools and enough education situations, and a lot of things are really written right down the pathway, classical, jazz, whatever, those things, those disciplines. I think for me to be successful and to just do a good job and feel good about what I'm doing, I need it very organic and very personable. If I make friends with the person I'm talking to, because I'm not talking to a class dictating in lesson 2, now this chapter you're going to write this piece and you're going to write this type of stuff. That's all covered. I don't need to get in line to do a mediocre job of what's already being done.
Right.
So if I make friends with somebody, they're going to listen. And then they're going to care about what's going on. I try to inspire them to teach themselves. I try to put myself out of business as soon as possible. So how do I do that? I want to learn this song. And then we just do that if it's a beginner. And then I say, well, have you heard this? I'm cheating. I'm trying to pull them along to what I think will help, and sometimes it doesn't work, but a lot of times it does. So it's a more interpersonal thing to try to use whatever my skill sets are, which I think is being involved in many different ways to play, rather than being a really great this or a really great that. And I think that's what I try to instill, that care about it. Care about yourself. Take yourself seriously. Start a journal. Ask those questions. Come with questions. I'm Google, right? You come and teach yourself, and I'm Google. Interactive Google. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's really, trying to use the different things that I've got.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, obviously you want to bring your personal experience into it in a way that's helpful and engaging to a student. One of the things that I was actually wondering about is, from what I gather, most of the Magic Band did not read music. And so you correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that when you were a teenager, you didn't read music either. And a lot of the sort of music that a guitarist is going to want to play, if they're playing blues-based music, is not necessarily things that are primarily written down, right? They're things that are learned in a different way. So how important is it, do you think, for a young guitarist to learn how to read music?
Very important. Very important. And I did read a little because I had taken lessons, just a few lessons. And like I said, I was trying to play these jazz standards. I am not a good reader to this day. I would need to practice 2 hours a day on my sight reading. That's not a skill set that I want to spend time on. But
yeah.
I read well enough to learn the material. Okay, so that's a choice that I made. I have this many hours to practice. So to answer your question, I'm going off a little bit there, but to answer your question, I think it's very important because that's the first recording machine. That's what it's the original tape recorder of what this stuff was, right? So you bring this music forward, and all of the information is in notation, not all of it, but it's very important to at least get to that. Do I cram it down their throats? No. They're going to get that from a lot of places, So if somebody's skittish about that and wants to play, and it's my job not to turn them into great musicians. It's my job to help them go forward because they're paying me. It's their dollar. Now, if that doesn't work, and sometimes I go, well, you're not working hard enough. Psh, out of here. You have to do that. If nothing else, a wake-up call. But music, reading notation is really important.
Okay.
Absolutely, because all the information is there.
Yeah. Well, that's quite interesting. I was wondering, actually, with regards to that, what sort of advice you would give to a younger musician who's considering doing something really off the beaten track, something, let's say, on the more experimental side of things. which you have experience with. And you, from what I gather, it was extraordinarily difficult dealing with just the conditions in which a lot of that music was made, and sort of the way that you as players were treated at the time. And I wonder what sort of advice you might give to this hypothetical young musician who maybe is interested in doing something that doesn't, let's say, fit into an established category already, but is really exploratory in nature.
I'm thinking of your side of the thing because I have checked your website out and what you think of this type of music. So that's involved in my answer. Again, I'm trying to be personal here, not just be the interviewee. But the thing is play what you love. And if that means, and I get a lot of kids and their parents, I want to go to music school. And the parents are like this. We want him to be a doctor, okay? And so I'll say something, this isn't blanket, but I will say this often, is find a way to pay for your life and care about your music. If you try to make a living playing music, more likely than not, you're going to have to play music you don't like to survive. I'm lucky to even do this, and it's because I married well, to be able to afford to be just a teacher, right? So it's protect the music, protect your identity to it, and care about it, and check it out, check things out, try anything, you know. And if this theoretical person you're talking about is really wanting to play avant-garde things, I do that, but don't skip over the other information. You know, I've seen, and this is a knee-jerk reaction for me, especially early Beefheart days and things like that. I saw a lot of fakers, and I wouldn't call us fakers. We couldn't do what you did with Fraulein, saying, okay, the opening licks in 7 and all of that. I could have done some of that, but we didn't think of it that way. That wasn't how it was done. That wasn't the process. You know, so know what you're doing, and maybe don't skip. Try simpler forms and build your way to that type of knowledge, because I think there's big holes in there if you skip. I'm sure you played Bach, you understood things like that before you became, you know, more experimental, newer, whatever your music is. But follow your heart is the basic thing.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense.
If you can pay for it and do that, and you're that type of person that can go out there and you're driven enough, and that's what you're going to do. I have 2 or 3 students that have done that. Mm-hmm. 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. Not the hundreds I've had.
Yeah, well, it's a rare thing statistically, though, isn't it? I mean, someone who can really doggedly stick to a personal vision, you know, despite all of the obstacles that one invariably encounters, you know, when you're facing the world, and generally speaking, the world doesn't want new things from you. It wants things that it can recognize and can fit into established categories. And if you're going outside of that, then there's going to be a certain degree of resistance. So you also have to, temperamentally, you have to have the kind of character that is able to face down that kind of resistance and keep going, and you know, until you eventually get there.
Right.
So yeah,
when you can really develop that, and once you develop that, it becomes maybe a little more obvious to people that wouldn't understand it. If you're only halfway there and you're teetering, maybe people, what's that? But if you're really there and you know what you're doing, even if you don't understand it, you can go, that person knows what they're doing. So I think there's, you know, when you get to that place, you develop it, and here it is. This is what I do. So
with regards to your playing, there's one question that I had actually, which was, you know, I was struck by the fact, listening to a great deal of your work and in preparing for this interview. So I listened to really early Beefheart stuff. I listened to your solo record. I listened also to the record that you did with John French, City of Refuge, and I've listened to the Mallard stuff, and there's definitely a very strong fingerprint that you have on everything you've done. There's clearly a sound and an approach to playing that, to my ears anyway, maybe it's different for you, but it sounds consistent. Obviously, there's progress, and you've greatly expanded your world in the intervening years. But there seems to be a consistency of, well, there's a consistency of something, let's put it that way, across your body of work. So I wonder, is that apparent to you, and how do you see it evolving from your earliest recordings up to now?
My first reaction to your question is, it's almost a negative thing. The things that I may not like about my playing, some of those things are still there. So those are the ones that stick out to me, because I'm my own policeman. It's like, why do I keep doing that? What is that habitual? So you got to record yourself and hear those things. So that's my first reaction, is the things I don't like. Like I said, I have a bluesy nature, which may not be expressed in, I hope it's not expressed in, like I said, did a second ago, in the most obvious form. But so that ties it together. But, if you think of me playing in Beefheart, I didn't write that music, so I'm playing very difficult things and grew a lot because of that, of course. I mean, that was really a great thing, not emotionally like we talked about, but learning-wise. But then from there, I went, okay, what am I doing now? Who am I? Because I'm not playing somebody else's music now. What am I going to play? That's why I've got into classic guitar, to just wipe the slate clean and then go from there. So, I've evolved, hopefully, what's similar is, it's just that's all I can come up with, really, is that it's a bluesy nature. I played with a very rigid feel in the Beefheart thing, and that was what was wanted. I tried to eradicate that because I didn't want it, and now I want part of that. I want that as part of a way to play.
When you say a bluesy feel, I mean, one thing that strikes me is there's a rhythmic approach that seems to be all over a lot of your material. I'm not exactly sure how to characterize it, but it's really rhythmically tight. I wonder if that's something that you've consciously worked on over the years, if that's a defining aspect of your style in some way or another.
Well, okay, you're saying that you think it is, and okay, great, thank you very much. And I do think that's a direct effect of the Beefheart band stuff, because somebody sent me a quote somewhere. It was you. That said that it was more the rhythmic structure of what we were doing in Trout Mask and Decals, but more so Trout Mask, that set it apart. That notes could have been exchanged, but it was the rhythmic impact of when we were together or fighting against each other, 3 against 4, 3 against 2, whatever, and those things, those rhythms. And those rhythms came from, listening to Coltrane, listening to jazz, listening to those things that were having those rhythms in it, and there's a strong imprint that happened there. That being said, one of my strengths as a learner was rhythms. I could play them early on. Weakness was technique and remembering all these parts. So rhythm was a very much organic part. So mostly it's organic. I haven't thought of any rhythms that I've had. I just let them fly. Okay?
Yeah.
But I do think the Beefheart thing really set that up.
Well, it must have, because having to memorize 28 pieces in over a 9-month period, I mean, that's not the sort of thing that typically happens. I mean, this is a very, very, very unusual approach in every respect, and music of extraordinary complexity too. So, I mean, one of the things that I mentioned in my video was that a typical Beefheart song from that period contains probably 10 times the amount of material, at least, as what you would get in a more average rock song. So the sheer quantity of things that you would have had to memorize without it being written down primarily is mind-boggling. So hearing you say that the memorization was tricky for you, I think is kind of amusing to hear, because I can't think of who wouldn't have found that tricky, to put it mildly.
I see what you're saying. I'm just saying what was more organic and what wasn't. I had to really work at it, and there was a lot of rehearsal, which is well documented. Playing and playing and playing and playing, So, and also, I was 19 years old. I could remember things then. It's a lot harder now. It takes more time to push the gray matter that is more concrete now to do that. So I'm answering from who I am now. So, yeah, I remembered those parts, but I played them hundreds and hundreds of times to be able to do that. And they were visual. Actually, they were movies to me.
Oh, can you explain that? That's interesting.
I'm a visual learner. Okay, so, and guitar is such a patterned thing. I can't imagine playing trumpet or a single note instrument and having that visual, because I can see, like on a keyboard, all the notes at once. I see a scale as like an ink blot, as opposed to da 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 da. I see all the notes at once. So once you see these blobs on the instrument, it's kind of how I memorize things. And then I chunk it together. So I see this ink blob here. This is this activity, boom, whatever the part is. And then I see this thing, and then this little thread that goes here, like this, like a thread, and then it goes up to this chunkier thing, but it's on a higher area. So there was a lot of visual movie thing. It was because I wasn't. this is a G major 7, and it's Lydian, so we have a flat 5 in it, blah, blah, blah. I'm not thinking like that at all. They were shapes.
Well,
So it became visual.
that's very interesting. So it's almost as if you had kind of a mental map of the guitar. Is that right? So you can visualize the frets and the different finger positions, and you're thinking more in sort of tactile, spatial terms rather than in terms of what the actual notes are.
Yes, definitely. And still kind of do that. I mean, I know what I'm playing now, hopefully. But it's always because of the nature of the instrument. You know, it's keys don't matter. Certain to a mostly degree they do, but I mean it's patterns. So it's like you're thinking in sense of numbers or whatever now, and it's just like here's the root and here's these distances from that place. So G is no different than A flat. You just move. On a piano, the shapes are all different. So keys matter, right? You have one scale form for each key. We have multiple scale forms for every key. They're the same scale forms for every key. So the instruments are so different. It becomes extremely pattern oriented. And then for the memorization part, I'm trying to break free of pattern oriented. I want to know what the note sounds like. I want to speak. Okay, but that's way different than the Beefheart thing. It was the memorization of that was shape oriented, area oriented, and just, you know, I knew it was a G when I'm trying to remember parts, but I can't. It's too long ago. But it was very shape movie for me, and that's how I always, you know, when I deal with a student that is not like that, we immediately realize that they're more, they need a name to call it or something like that, and I just have movies. And so sometimes it's harder to communicate with someone like that. That's just who I am.
Well, what about your inner ear? I mean, do you hear these things in your head before you play them, or do they just come out more in a tactile way, in a sense of you have gestures that are sort of built into your muscle memory, and they emerge that way, or how does that process work?
You're talking about now?
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully, it's both, and hopefully it's you hear it. Okay? That's what I'm working towards. But we all have cliched licks. You know, I can listen to a player and they play that and I go, oh, that's Pat Metheny. Like, he does that thing. Well, he's really, really incredibly good. But there's points where I don't know that it's conscious thing. So it's just like a speech pattern. If you say the word cool, you know, you're going to have your common speech patterns, and it's the same thing. But if I can make it like a voice, we're virtuoso speakers, decent musicians, and I just don't want it to be an instrument. I want it to be a voice. So I want it to be that. So I'll sing what interval it is. I'll sing what I'm playing and try to understand that. It gets hard when you have multi-notes. But so that's the goal. But still, a huge amount of the time, it's my hands just playing and I'm watching it go.
So we were talking about Trout Mask Replica and the process of putting those tracks together. And so one thing that's really interesting is that when you look at all of the different Beefheart records, it seems like he always had to have basically someone functioning as a musical director, right? So if you look at Safe as Milk, that would have been Ry Cooder, and on Trout Masks it was John French, and on Decals it was you. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process by which you ended up being the main musical director of that album and how that process worked.
Well, it was a pretty easy handoff. I mean, we all know John came and went a few times. So he was gone. Somewhere along the line of, I'm trying to think of the year, is it 1970 that cassette recorders were not invented, but probably put into production? And so we got a cassette recorder. And so at that point, it was a lot easier. I did no notation. So I was the person to do it. I don't know if that was decided, but I can only remember it evolved in some type of way, but it was just Mark and I and Don, right, and Art at that point. Then various people would come back, but it was a cassette recorder. So he'd say, Bill, come over and get this, because I was not living at the house anymore. And so I'd get in my car, was right up the street, and record, and I'd take some notes just about what this was, this and that, right? And then I didn't take any notation. I just went back and parsed it out from what they were on the tape. The first ones, if you go back to, I'm going to make this real long, but it describes a lot of the tunes on a lot of tunes were in E flat, okay, E flat minor. black keys on a piano, right? Okay, and he discovered the black keys. So a lot of these tunes, Big Dummy and etc. And again, I can't remember them all because I just moved on. But and then the Peon and One Red Rose, all white keys. So he found that major scaly thing, and he found that other thing. And so a lot of those tunes that came out were from that division. Okay. And then some of the tunes were just whistling parts, a lot of whistling parts. Big Toe was whistling. Lick Mighty Cows Off was actually in a rehearsal, kind of came about with main parts, just sang it, whistled it, da 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 da, no, that melody part. But the parts that were piano was just cassette, and I just learned the parts because he would play, and that you got that, and then there'd be a space, you got that. And I was the only guitar part. There it is, right? And then the other one's the bass part. That's all I remember about that part of it.
So from that point of view, I guess the process was substantially similar to how Trout Mask was put together. So he would go off and invent these parts, either whistling them or playing them on the piano, and then record them, and then you would be given a tape.
I had the tape. I just had box loads of, a suitcase full of tapes. I don't know where they are, but yeah, I'd have to learn the parts and then parse them out, try to stay as true to the parts as he played them, change things when necessary. I tried not to change order of things, but I did that a few times, just for playability or plausibility, and I didn't tell him. And then with One Red Rose and Peon, I moved a lot of things around and took some parts out. One story that really kind of set it up for me is when I came and played, I'd worked on One Red Rose, and I came up and played it for him, and he said, "Stop, Jan, come and listen to what I've done." And I knew, oh man, the overview was there, but it was just like, not quite, Don. So I had an inside feel for that part at that point, and that's why I was okay with doing it, but not saying that I wrote anything, not saying anything like that, just saying I cleaned up the mess.
With that in mind, I mean, the text that appears on the back of the record, where it states that all compositions are composed and arranged by Don Van Vliet, it seems like it's somewhat debatable, right? I mean, particularly not the composition aspect. I mean, I'm happy to accept that he actually wrote the parts, even though...
Absolutely.
Obviously, they had to be modified somewhat in order to fit the instruments, in order to, and in order to be made playable as such and to fit together with all the other parts. But the arrangement aspect... It seems to me that credit should be given to the musicians for that, because there was obviously a great deal of input that went into that in terms of precisely how things fit together, how many times you'd have to repeat a section, and so on and so forth. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the part that him claiming that he did all of this is just bull. It's just not true. Hearing John, remembering what John said about what his process was and how things had to be changed a little bit. So those things were articulated, but there was never anything like, well, let's fix this crap. That wasn't it. It was, we had to do what we felt was necessary to keep it to what it is without the ridiculousness of an impossible part, or let's flip those parts, it works better, that kind of stuff. So there was always those claims. I mean, I wrote it in 8.5 hours. Well, you sat at the piano for 3 hours today. Now, are you counting only the time your fingers touched the piano or the time John was working on the parts? It's that idea is such bullshit that it's easy to go, well, wait a minute, what did he do? He had a great overview of what it was, and the little parts in between were taken care of us, with more and more of us being part of that as things went on.
One thing that I find actually quite intriguing is the rhythmic aspects of these parts. I keep coming back to the rhythm because that's something that I think is so striking on those records. And I've heard actually some of the piano composition tapes. There's a few of them floating around. I think there's one on the Grow Fins box set, and there's a couple of others you can hear on the internet. And one of the things that really strikes me is they're kind of arrhythmic in a sense, right? There's no sense of pulse particularly. And if there is a pulse, it's fleeting, right? And he changes it. So... when approaching something like that, so when you were working on One Red Rose, for example, and you're dealing with a piano tape in which you can't really relate it to a rhythmic pulse of any particular kind.
Correct.
It's very rhythmically free. when you have to learn something like that, do you have to rationalize it mentally in terms of thinking, this is going to be an eighth note, this is a quarter note, in terms of figuring out what the tempo is going to be and all of this sort of thing? I'm just curious as to how that process worked, really, in terms of the rhythm.
It's not rubato, but it's free flowing, and that was the harder part with peon, because we had to do that together. So we rehearsed where it hurries, where it lays back, those things. But with One Red Rose, it was da 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 da. So it had this jumpy feel. So I tried to just stay true to those sections, even though the sections things were dropped out. This was flipped to make it move through the instrument better and be a more coherent thing. So there was a lot of edits in leaving parts out. But it was just imitative of the part. I think a lot of what you're saying is there was no time feel. There might have been a time feel, but his inability to accurately play it more than once made the time feel fumbly and confused the feeling of the time. So he goes da 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 da. Okay, he got it that time. Da 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 da. Is it 3 against 2 or whatever it is? I think he was trying to play it in a rhythm, and that he couldn't repeat the parts. I think that's part of that.
Right. So then his inability to reproduce the parts exactly as he maybe imagined them rhythmically, that then becomes part of the composition in a sense, because you're trying to duplicate that sort of slightly fumbly aspect to it.
Well, if it was there, if that's what was the part was repeated, but if the first one was correct and the second one had a edit in it, you just repeated the first one. Okay, and it became repeated rhythm. It depended. It just depended on if it was chunk 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 da 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 chunk 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 da da. However, then we had to interpret that, right?
Well, because there have been a few attempts made at actually transcribing these and producing sheet music of various songs from those albums. And I don't know if you've seen any of those, actually.
When the student of mine sent Frownland to me, that kind of went, wow. And then he found another one, so he's obviously checking YouTube videos. And there's these 4 guys, and I think they're in Oklahoma or something. It's a crew of people. And they did MIDI up these parts, and the drum parts sounded ridiculous, but still. And they were, 60, 70% accurate. And they'd done all these parts, and it was unique. They had to kind of MIDI it up, and so yeah, I heard that. But again, at that point, I'm not needing to revisit the music, and even what struck me about what you did with Frownland is you analyzed what it was. People say, oh, it's atonal and it's improvised and all that, and you said, polytonal, polyrhythmic, right? But very repeatable, and the tunes were repeated every time, right? And that kind of just says, no, it wasn't improvised. So that struck me. These things are sort of like, okay, it's interesting, I guess, but that's so long ago for me. I'm sorry, I just can't care that much about reproductions of things that were so long ago in my past. Interesting, when I listen to the record, at least that makes it more cohesive rather than seeing parts written out, okay? So that is more meaningful to me, is actually just listening to the record and just the sound of it and the overall part, because, you have to think of what went into these parts and that, and I like dissecting it. But then I just don't care anymore. I'm sorry. I'm doing something else.
I think that's entirely understandable. It's it just struck me that in a sense it's kind of, you can't really transcribe these pieces. They're not thought of in that way. They don't. I find they don't really work as sheet music, because the rhythmic aspect and the timbre, also the particular timbre and playing styles that you all had, these are things that you can't really notate very easily. And so there's an aspect of it that you kind of can't really capture and reproduce in a sense. So that leads me into another question, which is actually the particular guitar timbre of that album, which is something that I find really striking. And I think a lot of people have commented on this. It has a certain dryness, a kind of sharpness to it in the tone. And how do you... Well, first of all, what is your feeling about the guitar timbre today? Particularly in light of everything that you've done since then, where you've done a great deal of exploration of different guitar sounds across your recorded output, and also just how was that sound achieved technically? Because it's not simply a question of instruments and amplifiers. There's also a question of the right hand technique, which you've described as being very aggressive. How was the timbre created from a technical point of view, not just in terms of actual guitars and amplifiers and this sort of thing?
Basically, the metal finger picks, which Jeff was using, and I don't know that, I think it was I can't remember the guy that was in the band before me that was like a country player and played with Adventures and things. But I think he used them, and he was more of a Travis picking type guy, and I don't know how to play that. It's almost country, this that kind of thing. So I don't know how to play that. I don't like it really, but it was metal finger picks. And so, okay, now we're using those. And then and then as the trout mask thing started going in, it was play it harder, play it harder. And that's coming from Don. So I think what happened is we were stunning the strings. If you play so hard, they can't vibrate. You're hitting them so hard, they're hitting the neck. And so it's not freely, openly breathing. And that's what I don't like about it if I listen to it now. The redoing of Peon happened, but it was like to say there's another way that this stuff could be conceived. Okay, and that was a Mallard thing. But the finger picks I threw away immediately because I want to be able to have these tones. But it did make it consistent, over the top. I think the Telecaster that I played, and I had a 330 I think at the time too, but the Telecaster has a brittle nature to it, and the terrible amplifiers we used. But it was basically stunning the instrument by plucking so hard. Another technique that comes out of that is, and this was pretty interesting, and we actually, rock guys are playing power chords, and we did a bunch of that. But it was an area where he says, strike the strings, and this is a very cool part. It has that sound, So being able to deaden notes and overplay this hand so hard where you're muting strings, but you might only be playing one note. This turns into Stevie Ray Vaughan blues stuff. But the stunning effect of that, instead of a real different effect by beating the crap out of the guitar. Here's one. You can't play it that way. Okay, you can't just play the notes in the duration. You have to play it. That nature is what was going on there, and it was using heavier strings, which I would tear off the guitar. So very, very opposite of what I'm trying to do now. But
so it was very percussive, basically.
Very percussive. It was hard to get the notes to sustain the tone on the instruments. Jeff had he was using the 330 on Top Mask, and he had a warmer, mellower tone. He had a mellower sound to it, believe it, saying that in this. But in that context, it was compared to me at the Telecaster on the back pickup with metal finger picks, just terrorizing the strings. So it had these stunned strings effect, which fit the hyperness and the over the top energy of the recording or the music.
That's really interesting to me because there's actually a contemporary string technique, used on string instruments, violins and cellos and so on, which is used in a lot of 20th century string quartet repertoire, where you take the string and you do a pizzicato, but you pull it so hard that it actually snaps back and rebounds off the fingerboard. And that's called a Bartók pizzicato.
I was going to say it sounds like Bartók, the plump, 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 plump. I listen to the Bartók quartets every once in a while just to find out if I'm increasing my music ability, because I can hear more of it every time. Some of my favorite music. But that blink, 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 right? And there's this slapping against the neck. You can tell that's going on.
I was wondering one other thing. In your book, you mentioned some of the things that you were listening to at the time, and there were a lot of names associated with the avant-garde. So people like Stockhausen and Albert Ehler and Ornette Coleman and so on. And I'm wondering if these types of musicians had an effect on your playing. If these were just things that you were listening to, they were sort of part of your overall cultural world at the time, or if you were actually pulling things in from those recordings and trying to incorporate them into your playing.
No, more the cultural thing. I wouldn't have known enough to be able to learn things. I tried to cop licks off of things like that, but it was more of the early schooling of we were going to be artists, and we were these kids, desert rats, and Don saw himself as an artist, and rightly so. But I think they were just more about feed the kids some Harry Partch, so they're not listening to blues licks and stuff. So that it was more of the whole cultural thing, and in hindsight, I'd never sign up to have this much abuse, but in hindsight, it ends up being a real strength that I got introduced to music like that and that it was legitimate. And especially then getting to meet people like that. It made somebody that does that for a living, as wow, I was going to be a mailman, and now I see Harry Parch, and it made things like that possible for me because I did not grow up in that environment. I was a little middle class kid, so it was more cultural. I wasn't learning that not till later.
But it was something that was present. So you and the other members of the band, and presumably Don also, were aware of and interested in sort of experimental composed music, 20th century music, things like Stravinsky and Stockhausen and Bartók and so on at the time? Or did you become more aware of it later? Or
No, those were at the time. I mean, it was very specific, the electronic Stockhausen, Pauline Oliveros, those were things he played. And then he'd go back and play us Bob Dorough, who was this jazz singer with this interesting, funny voice. And then Teresa Brewer, which he learned his little hiccup thing he does in his voice from her. But these were odd little tidbits. But basically, it was the ones that were artistic outside things that were influencing us. We didn't do a lot of listening. We were practicing. Okay, so there wasn't a lot of listening sessions, but there was just this introduction of those things. And only till later, again, when I started learning more about what's inside music and how it's built and all of that, and there's a lot of stories I get about that, but it was just, I think it was influence. And then when Don and Ornette started hanging out, it became a different kind of thing.
Yeah, I just find it completely fascinating. You mentioned Pauline Oliveros, actually, who died very recently. And there was at that time, I mean, in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a kind of temporary cross-fertilization of the avant-garde, the sort of European avant-garde, with popular music in America. When I say popular, I don't necessarily mean commercial music, because I think it's two separate things. You can have music that comes out of popular traditions that's not necessarily commercial, right? And you can have commercial music that isn't necessarily based on popular idioms. But this idea that you would have avant-garde European music somehow influencing music coming out of popular traditions, and that they would fuse and create this extraordinarily powerful type of expression, I think is quite fascinating. It didn't last very long necessarily, right? You don't see a great deal of that as the 70s wear on. But was that something that you were consciously aware of at the time, that this was a very novel kind of blending of two very different musical streams?
Not at the time, no. Again, Hot House, we were doing what we did. That was it, with this mild influence inside the Hot House. Very soon after that, I realized that, actually, it was probably after I was in the band, that what happened is in the 60s, even though this is through a rock, outlet, not that it was rock, bands, if you could stand up and tune your instrument, you got a record deal. There was, you could play, and I think the business people were taken. What do we do with this? How do we market this, right? Because they're looking at money, and they go, now we need all these hippie guys or whatever they're thinking, long hair bands, and we need to sign them and make money off of them. So the bands were controlling what was going on. So the influence from outside influences could happen as it got more and more controllable as we got into the 70s and they started making more money. The bands were then more pared down. You don't get to record that song on your album, that kind of stuff. So more and more, I think, corporate control started changing what the music business was. In the 60s and very early 70s, it was still free, and they didn't know how to make money from these people, so they got to do their own music more. I think it's corporate influence, actually.
It seems like there was a period where people just had no idea what was going to be marketable and what wasn't, and they would just try anything. And it sort of resulted in this extraordinary renaissance of musical creativity. But yeah, I guess once they realized how much money there was to be made and started getting a little bit more scientific about what would work and what wouldn't. So,
exactly.
Okay, I just have a few more questions, and one of them is actually the extraordinary longevity of these albums. I mean, well, I think you could say that about most of the Beefheart albums. Most of them are extraordinarily persistent. People are still fascinated by them 40, 45, 50 years later. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your perspective on that, and what is it exactly about these albums that has made them stick around so much? I mean, there's an enduring fascination. Generation after generation discovers them.
Well, off the top of my head, I think if you do something that is so, and you're first on the block, if you do something that is so different and definitely Trout Mask and Lick My Decals Off would be in that grouping there. Changed, and then there was other elements that still stick, Clear Spot or whatever, that stick with that, but have a uniqueness to it. But excuse me, to it. But I think when there's no neighbors, there's nobody else doing that. It sets itself up for it. Again, is it a rock album? No. Is it? What is it? If it's unbustable, I mean, if you do something that unique and unbustable, you can't put it in a box. If it could have been put in a box and the people that followed it had maybe done a better version of it or had grown in that way, I think people may have tried. Maybe they did and I haven't heard it, so I don't want to say that we did it and nobody else did, because that's not what I think. But I think it is that it is so unusual at the time, and and it just didn't happen again. So it's just like it was frozen moment in time, and it didn't keep getting replicated. And it's there it is, and especially because it has exposure in that world of pop culture, right? I mean, I think of things that you might write. That's not going to. I wish it would for your sake, but you're going to write things. It's not pop culture that's going to grab onto that. It's a different set of people, and that they're expecting change and they're expecting these things. And so there's I think, probably a more rational, even keel. This was just a bomb that blew up in the 60s along with the culture, and nothing else kind of succeeded it. Had it been rooted in something more obvious, it would have been, I think it wouldn't be, I won't call it revered, as notable.
Well, it does have an extraordinary freshness to it, and that's one thing that always strikes me in what I would consider to be great works of art, is that they don't lose their newness, right? So you can hear them, many times, and you can hear them over an extended span of time, and when you come back to them, they'll still have something new to say to you, and they'll still appear new and fresh in a certain sense. And listening to some great orchestral masterworks of the earlier part of the 20th century, I was at a concert a few weeks ago where I heard The Rite of Spring, and I mean that's a piece from 1913, and it sounds absolutely fresh. It's a kind of permanent new quality to it, and I would say that Trout Mask and Decals and a lot of the other Beefheart stuff as well, they have that quality, and it's a very, very rare quality. It's not something that you can come up with off the cuff. It's something that I would almost say you have to be sort of historically lucky in a sense in order to have that happen.
Absolutely, but thinking of Stravinsky and the skill set, learning to do that and to write pieces of music, and then I don't know, I'm just off. This, I don't, but I know the piece of music and love it. And I totally identify with what you're saying, is that it's fresh again. That's why I said when I revisit the Bartok thing, it's just like I hear more. I don't know exactly. I'm not digesting what scale or what folk melody he was using to create these things, but I can hear it and digest it and hear it and learn every time I listen to it, and I learn more. I love it. It's my morning walk music. But I do think it's lucky. I do think it's amount of time, because I think culture has a lot to do with it. I mean, I heard Paganini was the first rock hero, right? Where he's, women's underwear going up on the stage because he could just play all these notes or whatever. But I think that was a thing, So had we had more documentation of that time period, it's been going along like that for a long time. But to bring it back to the Beefheart stuff, it just bombed, and we're talking in 1969. So it was a wide open, perfect timing for something like that to happen. And Frank Zappa facilitated it. There's that too. I mean, he's letting this happen, and he's creating the money to go into the studio to do that. There was some foresight there too.
Did you have a good relationship with Frank Zappa?
I always did. He was always working very hard. He was a great inspiration for how hard he worked. But no, I always had a good relationship with Frank. Oh yeah, that's that chord. Ooh, when I learned that a major 7 chord, a G major 7, is an E minor 9. Oh my God. Big things. So we would talk guitar stuff, and he gave me these little 3x5 cards. He was incarcerated for making blue movies for a few months at some point in his early career, and he had written out all these scales on these cards, and he says, "Here, check these out." I don't have them, but no, I had a great relationship with him, and I thought he really put up with a lot of crap from Don and situation with the band and all that. But the only part I ever saw was good.
Yeah.
Now, knowing band members, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Everybody that is working that hard, when there's people behind them, the wake that person makes does ruffle feathers or bounces people around behind them because they're all in the food chain. So that's just the nature of that.
Well, I mean, it was a wonderful thing that he facilitated the recording of the album, and I mean, I know Don was very critical about him, on a number of occasions, and they didn't really see eye to eye and had a falling out at some point. But I mean, just the fact that he would do that with a record that clearly was not going to be a smash commercial success, and that was not going to be an easy sell, and he did it anyway, and he put it out, and basically gave Don complete creative control. So it's a very laudable thing, whatever else one might have said about him. So.
No, I agree with that, but he was also putting out things like Wildman Fisher. So it kind of put us in that we're going, wait a minute. So I understand that part for us because we're working that hard, and he's putting us in this comedy crazy street person realm. So I understand that, but from Frank's perspective, all of it facilitates him. I mean, it was helping him. I mean, he wouldn't, you know what I mean? It wasn't going to hurt his credibility by facilitating that.
Well, we just had a few minutes left, but there's a couple of things I just wanted to ask you very quickly, and you've been very patient with all of my questions, so thank you so much for taking the time to do this. There's one figure from that time period that is, let's say he's become somewhat shadowy, and that's Jeff Cotton, and we don't hear much from him, and we don't know really what he's doing these days. And I wonder if you have any contact with him or if you have any idea of what he's up to these days.
I had contact with Jeff for a while. He was way out of contact for a long time. Then he started calling me, and then I called him back. I lost contact. It was really great. This is it's going to be, I'm going to say, at least 8-9 years ago or whatever. But it was really good for me to talk to him because Jeff and I had become friends before he joined the band and then me later. I do know that recently he lost his life partner, his wife, spouse. And so I think he's going through some tough times, and that's why he's kind of been invisible because there's some people that wanted to talk to him. And I don't know, it wasn't you, it was for some other reason. John French and I keep in contact. I just wish him the best. I learned a lot from Jeff. He was a very good guitar player. We were best of friends kind of at this one period of time. There was always guitar competition, so we were kind of that thing too as teenagers, but I really liked Jeff. Always had a great feeling for him, and I learned a lot in that really early time in the Beefheart band. And his exit was horrible. So I just wish him the best. I don't have contact with him though.
Yeah, no, I mean it's amazing that the majority of the people involved in that project and the other ones, got through it. I'd like to say as well as they did in a sense, because it going through something like that so young could have just traumatized somebody terribly.
It did. It did. It did all of us, I'm sure, in various degrees. It's still there. It's still there, but most of it's positive at this point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have this extraordinary music, and I mean, it's interesting to consider whether, from the perspective of someone who had to actually suffer through all of it, whether it was in fact worth it, on a personal level to deal with all of that. But at least for those of us who love the music, it's there and it's absolutely wonderful, and it tremendously enriched so many people's lives. And so, there was a terrible price to be paid in terms of actually putting it together, but the recorded legacy is absolutely unique, and I think it's going to stand the test of time.
That's really cool. The whole thing for me is, it was all of those things. I learned from those things. Trauma creates knowledge, I don't want to sign up and go through it again, but it created a lot of knowledge. When Don died, we all were asked to say some things on a website, and it made me think about, what do I think about it? Because it was a real obvious moment. And it's pretty easy to just forget because I don't have to live with that anymore. I don't have to live with any of the hard part of it. And I have to take responsibility, and I think everybody else has to take responsibility for, if you're stupid enough to put up with that, you have to own it, right? Even though we were young, I had to own that I was perfectly set up to take such abuse. I needed, my lack of self-esteem at that young age allowed me to do that. In hindsight now, I get to live through the idea of what you said, which thank you very much. Something I did had an impact. That's a nice thing to feel, that whether it was intended in a very general sense. Lucky me, I get to feel that now. So that it's turned into a real positive thing. I don't live through that music, and I don't, as I've said in the interview, I like parts of it now a lot more than I used to. I'm hearing it from a little more of a musical education rather than just an attitude. But it's all fine with me. And if I did something that made somebody's life better because of that, and it's bigger than your next door neighbor saying hello, awesome. That's great.
Well, I can tell you, I first encountered that music when I was maybe 15 or something like this. And strangely enough, I mean, first of all, I liked it instantly, immediately. There was no delay. It just it immediately spoke to me. And in a funny sense, it was almost consoling that somebody else on the planet thought this way and expressed themselves this way and could play this way, you know, and just knowing that had happened and that existed and that it spoke really strongly to me was just a tremendously enriching thing, you know, and it gave me actually, I would say, a great deal of courage and strength in terms of pursuing my own vision. It's a wonderful thing to observe artists, musicians of all stripes. You know, this touches upon something that we mentioned very much at the outset. Basically, following a personal path and not deviating from it, and it's just a testimony, I think, to the strength of the human spirit, that you can get through these sorts of difficulties and come out with something absolutely amazing at the other end. You know, so speaking as a you know, someone who loves this music very deeply, I can only say thank you for having done it and having preserved it for everyone to hear.
Well, thank you for saying that. You know, it makes me happy about that. But like I said, the very much the same thing for me. Meeting Harry Parch. I mean, I'm in the band for 2 weeks, and we're sitting front row with Frank Zappa, Don, and me, and I can't remember somebody else was there. Maybe it was Gail Zappa. And Harry Parch comes down, and we're talking to him, and I'm seeing all these instruments, and I'm going, man, where have I landed? And then meeting Ornette, and you're just having casual conversations. And when we played in New York, and Pharoah Sanders and blah, blah, all these people are there, and Charlie Mingus, who wouldn't talk to me, but he was there. Those were people that I revered, and that, man, this is their lifestyle. I had such a conservative middle class upbringing that it took something that break it open like that. Like, I could live my life quite differently than this, and just like what you were saying about this, you know, is that early experience of being around grown-ups that worked hard at something that not Main Street. You know, it was, same thing. So the people that keep doing this or are part of it, you know, they're setting it free for somebody. That's why I like music, you know.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good note to end on.
Okay. Well, thank you, Samuel.
Thank you so much. And for anyone who hasn't already done so, I would certainly encourage everyone to read your book, Lunar Notes, and also to hear your solo record, which is absolutely wonderful as well. So again, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Okay. Thank you.